Thank you very much, dear Federal Chancellor, Mr. Telchik. Ladies and gentlemen, I am very grateful for the invitation to such a representative conference, which has brought together politicians, military personnel, entrepreneurs, and experts from more than 40 countries. The conference format allows me to avoid excessive politeness and the need to speak in rounded, pleasant, but empty diplomatic clichés. The conference format allows me to say what I really think about the problems of international security. And if my reasoning seems to our colleagues to be overly polemically pointed or inaccurate, I ask you not to be angry with me. After all, this is only a conference, and I hope that after 2 to 3 minutes of my speech, Mr. Telchik will not turn on the red light there. So, it is known that the problems of international security are much broader than issues of military political stability. This is the stability of the global economy, overcoming poverty, economic security, and the development of intercivilizational dialogue. This comprehensive, indivisible nature of security is also expressed in its basic principle: the security of each is the security of all. As Franklin Roosevelt said in the early days of the flaring up of World War II, "Wherever peace is broken, peace is everywhere unsafe and under threat." These words remain relevant today. Incidentally, this is evidenced by the theme of our conference, which is written here: Global Crises, Global Responsibility. Just 2 decades ago, the world was ideologically and economically divided, and its security was ensured by the enormous strategic potential of 2 superpowers. The global confrontation pushed extremely acute economic and social issues to the periphery of international relations and the agenda. And like any war, the Cold War left us with exploding shells, figuratively speaking. I mean ideological stereotypes, double standards, and other patterns of bloc thinking. The unipolar world proposed after the Cold War also did not materialize. The history of mankind, of course, knows periods of unipolarity and the desire for world domination. There have been so many in the history of mankind. However, what is a unipolar world? No matter how this term is embellished, it ultimately means only one thing in practice. It is one center of power, one center of strength, one center of decision-making. It is the rule of one master, one sovereign. And this is ultimately destructive not only for everyone within this system, but also for the sovereign itself, because it destroys it from within. And this has nothing in common, of course, with democracy, because democracy is, as we know, the power of the majority, taking into account the interests and opinions of the minority. By the way, Russia, we are constantly taught democracy, but for some reason those who teach us do not really want to learn themselves. I believe that for the modern world, a unipolar model is not only unacceptable, but also impossible. And not only because with sole leadership in the modern world, namely in the modern world, there will not be enough military, political, or economic resources. But what is even more important is that the model itself is not working, since it is not based and cannot have a moral and ethical basis for modern civilization. At the same time, everything that is happening in the world today, and we have only just begun to discuss it, is a consequence of attempts to introduce this concept into world affairs, the concept of a unipolar world. And what is the result? Unilateral, often illegitimate actions have not solved a single problem. Moreover, they have become a generator of new human tragedies and hotbeds of tension. Judge for yourself. Warrior, there are no fewer local and regional conflicts. Mr. Telchik mentioned this very gently. And no fewer, but even more people die in these conflicts than before. Significantly more. Significantly more. Today we are witnessing an almost unrestrained, hypertrophied use of force in international affairs, military force that plunges the world into the abyss of conflicts following one after another. As a result, there are not enough forces for a comprehensive solution to any of them. Their political solution is becoming impossible. We see an increasing disregard for the fundamental principles of international law. Moreover, individual norms and, in fact, almost the entire legal system of one state, primarily, of course, the United States, have crossed their national borders and, in fact, in all spheres, both economics and politics and the humanitarian sphere, are being imposed on other states. Well, who will like that? Who will like that? In international affairs, there is an increasing desire to resolve this or that issue based on the so-called political expediency, based on the current political situation. And this, of course, is extremely dangerous and leads to the fact that no one feels safe anymore. I want to emphasize this. No one feels safe, because no one can hide behind international law, as if behind a stone wall. Such a policy is, of course, a catalyst for the arms race. The dominance of the force factor inevitably fuels the desire of some countries to possess weapons of mass destruction. Moreover, fundamentally new threats have emerged that were known before, but today are acquiring a global character, such as terrorism. I am convinced that we have come to that turning point when we must seriously think about the entire architecture. Global security. And here we must start from the search for a reasonable balance between the interests of all subjects of international communication. Especially now, when the international landscape is changing so noticeably and so quickly, changing due to the dynamic development of a number of states and regions. Madam Federal Chancellor has already mentioned this. Thus, the total GDP of India and China in terms of purchasing power parity is already greater than that of the United States of America. And calculated on the same principle, the GDP of the BRIC states, Brazil, Russia, India, China, exceeds the total GDP of the European Union. And according to experts, in the foreseeable historical perspective, this gap will only increase. There is no doubt that the economic potential in the new centers of global growth will inevitably be converted into political influence and will strengthen multipolarity. In this regard, the role of multilateral diplomacy is seriously increasing. Openness, transparency, and predictability of politics are the only option, and the use of force should be a truly exceptional measure, as is the use of the death penalty in the legal systems of some states. Today, on the contrary, we are witnessing a situation where countries have banned the use of the death penalty even for murderers and other criminals, dangerous criminals. Despite this, such countries readily participate in military operations that can hardly be called legitimate. After all, people die in these conflicts, hundreds, thousands of peaceful people. But at the same time, the question arises, should we really look on indifferently and weak-willedly at various internal conflicts in individual countries, at the actions of authoritarian regimes, tyrants, at the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction? This was essentially the basis of the question that was asked of the Federal Chancellor by our esteemed colleague, Mr. Lieberman. Can we look on indifferently at what is happening? I will try to answer your question too. Of course, we should not watch indifferently. Of course not. But do we have the means to counter these threats? Of course we do. It is enough to recall recent history. After all, there was a peaceful transition to democracy in our country. After all, there was a peaceful transformation of the Soviet regime. A peaceful transformation. And what kind of regime? With what quantity of weapons, including nuclear weapons? Why is it necessary to bomb and shoot at every opportunity now? Is it really true that in the absence of the threat of mutual destruction, we lack political culture? Respect for the values of democracy and for the law? I am convinced that the only mechanism for making decisions on the use of military force as a last resort can only be the UN Charter. And in this regard, I either did not understand what was said recently by our colleague, the Italian Minister of Defense, or he expressed himself inaccurately. In any case, I heard that, the use of force can only be considered legitimate if the decision is made in NATO or the European Union or the UN. If he really thinks so, then we have different points of view. Or so I heard. The use of force can only be considered legitimate if the decision is made on the basis and within the framework of the UN. And there is no need to replace the United Nations with either NATO or the European Union. And when the O really unites the forces of the international community, which can really respond to events in individual countries, when we get rid of disregard for international law, then the situation may change. Otherwise, the situation will only reach a dead end and multiply the number of serious mistakes. At the same time, of course, we must strive to ensure that international law has a universal character both in understanding and in the application of norms. And we must not forget that a democratic way of acting in politics necessarily presupposes discussion and painstaking decision-making. Esteemed ladies and gentlemen, the potential danger of destabilization of international relations is also associated with the obvious stagnation in the field of disarmament. Russia is in favor of resuming dialogue on this most important issue. It is important to maintain the stability of the international legal disarmament framework. At the same time, to ensure the continuity of the process of reducing nuclear weapons. We have agreed with the United States of America to reduce our nuclear potential on strategic carriers to 1,700–2,200 nuclear warheads by December 31, 2012. Russia intends to strictly fulfill its obligations. We hope that our partners will also act transparently and will not put aside an extra couple of 100-degree warheads just in case, for a rainy day. And if today the new Secretary of Defense of the United States announces to us here that the United States will not hide these extra charges either in warehouses, or under a pillow, or under a blanket, I suggest that everyone stand up and greet this standing. This would be a very important statement. Russia strictly adheres and intends to continue to adhere to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons and the Multilateral Missile Technology Control Regime. The principles laid down in these documents are universal. In this regard, I would like to recall that in the 1980s, the USSR and the United States signed a treaty on the elimination of an entire class of medium and short-range missiles, but this document was not given a universal nature. Today, a number of countries already have such missiles. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the Republic of Korea, India, Iran, Pakistan, Israel. Many other countries in the world are developing these systems and plan to put them into service. And only the United States of America and Russia are obliged not to create such weapon systems. It is clear that in these conditions we are forced to think about ensuring our own security. At the same time, we cannot allow the emergence of new destabilizing high-tech weapons. I am not even talking about measures to prevent new areas of confrontation, especially in space. And Star Wars, as we know, are no longer science fiction, but reality. Back in the mid-80s, our American partners actually intercepted their own satellite. The militarization of space, in Russia's opinion, could provoke unpredictable consequences for the world community. No less than the beginning of the nuclear era. And we have repeatedly put forward initiatives aimed at preventing weapons in space. Today I would like to inform you that we have prepared a draft treaty on preventing the placement of weapons in outer space. In the near future, it will be sent to our partners as an official proposal. Let's work on this together. We also cannot help but be concerned about the plans to deploy elements of an anti-missile defense system in Europe. Who needs another round of the inevitable arms race in this case? I deeply doubt that the Europeans themselves do not have missile weapons that could really threaten Europe with a range of about 5,000 to 8,000 kilometers in any of the so-called problem countries. And in the foreseeable future, they will not appear, and are not even expected. And the hypothetical launch of, for example, a North Korean missile at the territory of the United States through Western Europe, this clearly contradicts the laws of ballistics. As we say in Russia, it is the same as with the right ear, the right with the right hand to reach the left ear. And being here in Germany, I cannot not mention the crisis state of the Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe. The Adapted Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe was signed in 1999. It took into account the new geopolitical reality, the liquidation of the Warsaw Pact. 7 years have passed since then, and only 4 states have ratified this document, including the Russian Federation. NATO countries openly stated that they will not ratify the treaty, including the provision on flank restrictions, on the deployment of a certain number of armed forces on the flanks, until Russia withdraws its bases from Georgia and Moldova. Our troops are being withdrawn from Georgia, and even in an accelerated manner. We have resolved these problems with our Georgian colleagues, and everyone knows this. In Moldova, there remains a group of 1,500 servicemen who perform peacekeeping functions and guard ammunition depots left over from the Soviet era. And Mr. Solana and I constantly discuss this issue. He knows our position. We are ready to continue working in this direction. But what is happening at the same time? And at the same time, so-called light American forward bases with 5,000 bayonets each are appearing in Bulgaria and Romania. It turns out that NATO is moving its forward forces to our state borders, and we, strictly observing the treaty, do not react to these actions in any way. I think it is obvious that the process of NATO expansion has nothing to do with the modernization of the alliance itself or with ensuring security in Europe. On the contrary, it is a seriously provoking factor that reduces the level of mutual trust. And we have a fair right to ask frankly who this expansion is against and what happened to those assurances that were given by Western partners after the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact. Where are those statements now? No one even remembers them, but I will allow myself to remind this audience. I would like to quote from the speech of NATO Secretary General Mr. Warner in Brussels on May 17, 1990. He said then, "The very fact that we are ready not to deploy NATO troops outside the territory of the FRG gives the Soviet Union firm security guarantees." Where are these guarantees? The stones and concrete blocks of the Berlin Wall have long since been sold as souvenirs. But we must not forget that its fall was made possible, among other things, by the historical choice, including that of our people, the people of Russia, the choice in favor of democracy and freedom, openness and sincere partnership with all members of the large European family. Now they are trying to impose new dividing lines on us. Let them be virtual, but still dividing, cutting through our common continent. Will it really take many years and decades, a change of several generations of politicians, to dismantle these new walls? Ladies and gentlemen, we are unequivocally in favor of strengthening the non-proliferation regime. The existing international legal framework makes it possible to create technologies for the production of nuclear fuel for peaceful purposes. And many countries, with good reason, want to create their own nuclear energy as the basis of their energy independence. But we also understand that these technologies can be quickly transformed into weapons-grade materials. This causes serious international tension. A striking example of this is the situation with the Iranian nuclear program. If the international community does not develop a reasonable solution to this conflict of interests, the world will continue to be shaken by such destabilizing crises. Because there are more threshold countries than Iran. And you and I know this. We will constantly face the threat of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Last year, Russia put forward an initiative to create multinational uranium enrichment centers. We are open to the idea of such centers being created not only in Russia, but also in other countries where peaceful nuclear energy exists on a legitimate basis. States wishing to develop nuclear energy could be guaranteed to receive fuel through direct participation in the work of these centers, of course, under the strict control of the IAEA. The latest initiatives of the President of the United States of America, George Bush, are in line with the Russian proposal. I believe that Russia and the United States are objectively and equally interested in tightening the regimes of non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and their means of delivery. It is our countries, which are leaders in nuclear and missile potential, that should also become leaders in developing new, tougher measures in the sphere of non-proliferation. Russia is ready for such work. We are holding consultations with our American friends. In general, we should talk about creating a whole system of political levers and economic incentives under which the state would be interested in not creating its own nuclear fuel cycle capacities, but would have the opportunity to develop nuclear energy, strengthening its energy potential. In this regard, I will dwell in more detail on international energy cooperation. Madam Federal Chancellor also briefly mentioned this, but touched on this topic. In the energy sector, Russia is focused on creating uniform market principles and transparent conditions for all. It is obvious that the price of energy resources should be determined by the market, and not be the subject of political speculation, economic pressure, or blackmail. We are open to cooperation. Foreign companies are participating in our largest energy projects. According to various estimates, up to 26% of oil production in Russia, please think about this figure, up to 26% of oil production in Russia comes from foreign capital. Try to give me an example of such a wide presence of Russian business in key sectors of the economy of Western countries. There are no such examples. Let me also remind you of the ratio of investments coming into Russia and going from Russia to other countries of the world. The ratio is approximately 15:1. Here is a visible example of the openness and stability of the Russian economy. Economic security is an area where everyone should adhere to uniform principles. We are ready to compete fairly. The Russian economy is increasingly gaining opportunities for this. Such dynamics are objectively assessed by experts and our foreign partners. Thus, Russia's rating in the OECD was recently raised. Our country moved from the fourth risk group to the third. And I would like to take this opportunity here today in Munich to thank our German colleagues for their assistance in making the above-mentioned decision. Further, as you know, the process Russia's accession to the WTO has reached the final stage. I would like to note that during the long and difficult negotiations, we have heard many times about freedom of speech, freedom of trade, equal opportunities, but for some reason exclusively in relation to our market, the Russian market. Another important topic that directly affects global security. Today, there is a lot of talk about the fight against poverty. What is really happening here? On the one hand, financial resources are allocated for programs to help the poorest countries. And sometimes not small financial resources, but honestly, and many here also know this, often for the development of companies from the donor countries themselves. But at the same time, on the other hand, subsidies in agriculture are maintained in developed countries. Access to high technology is limited for others. And let's call a spade a spade. It turns out that with one hand, charitable aid is distributed, and with the other, not only economic backwardness is preserved, but profits are also collected. The emerging social tension in such depressed regions inevitably results in the growth of radicalism, extremism, fuels terrorism and local conflicts. And if all this also happens, say, in the Middle East, in conditions of a heightened perception of the outside world as unfair, then a risk of global destabilization arises. It is obvious that the world's leading countries must see this threat and, accordingly, build a more democratic, fair system of economic relations in the world, a system that gives everyone a chance and opportunity for development. Speaking at a conference on security, dear ladies and gentlemen, one cannot pass over in silence the activities of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. As is known, it was created to consider all, I emphasize this, all aspects of security, military, political, economic, humanitarian, and in their interrelation. Today, what do we see in practice? We see that this balance is clearly violated. They are trying to turn the OSCE into a vulgar instrument for ensuring the foreign policy interests of one or a group of countries in relation to other countries. And for this task they have cut out the bureaucratic apparatus of the OSCE, which is absolutely not connected with the founding states. They have tailored the decision-making procedures for this task and the use of so-called non-governmental organizations, formally, yes, independent, but specifically financed, and therefore controlled. According to the fundamental documents, in the humanitarian sphere, the OSCE is called upon to assist member countries, at their request, in observing international human rights standards. This is an important task. We support it, but this does not mean interference in the internal affairs of other countries, much less imposing on these states how they should live and develop. Obviously, such interference does not contribute to the maturation of truly democratic states and, on the contrary, makes them dependent and, as a result, unstable in political and economic terms. We expect that the OSCE will be guided by its immediate tasks and build relations with sovereign states on the basis of respect and trust. Esteemed ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, I would like to note the following. We very often, and I personally very often hear calls for Russia from our partners, including from European partners, to play a more and more active role in world affairs. In this regard, I would like to make one small remark. It is unlikely that we need to be pushed and stimulated to do this. Russia is a country with more than 1,000 years of history, and it has almost always enjoyed the privilege of pursuing an independent foreign policy. We are not going to change this tradition today. At the same time, we clearly see how the world has changed, we realistically assess our own capabilities and our own potential. And, of course, we would also like to deal with responsible and also independent partners, with whom we could work together to build a fair and democratic world order, ensuring security and prosperity in it, not for the chosen few, but for everyone. Thank you for your attention.